Welcome to the Borderless Podcast, your guide to traveling, investing, and living beyond borders, where we talk about living the life that you want to live, where you want to live it. From beautiful San Miguel de Allende, smack in the middle of Mexico, with your hosts, Jonathan Lockwood and James Guzman.
Welcome to the Borderless Podcast, traveling, investing, and living beyond borders. We're glad you could join us today, and we very much appreciate your listening and participating in this community. If you're interested in a more international life, finding a place on the globe that's better for you, a location-independent income, and more self-reliance in general, you are welcome here, my friend. We're podcasting from the Borderless compound in the beautiful colonial Mexican town of San Miguel de Allende. My name's Jonathan Lockwood, and I'm here with James Guzman, who is presently spending time on the beach near Viña del Mar in Reñaca, Chile. Are you there, James?
Hey, I'm here, but you know what? The internet is not very stable. There was some problems here just this morning, and I think they're fixing it. But because of the instability, maybe it'd be better for me just to just listen here, and maybe I'll pop back in at the end.
Okay, that sounds good. And, I hear the weather's great there. I hope you're having a great time. We'll touch base after the interview. Okay, I first discovered our guest today sometime in 2012. And although I enjoyed the topics he covered, I remember being particularly impressed with the demeanor of his writing. I just found him not only very well-informed, intelligent, and interesting, but also very decent. So if you're like me, and from the surveys we receive, I know many of you are, I can't recommend a resource more than Sovereign Man by Simon Black. Simon Black is the founder of Sovereign Man, an international entrepreneur and investor. He travels the globe looking for personal and economic opportunities to enrich his and his subscribers' lives. Prior to this life, he graduated from West Point and became an Army intelligence officer. After his time in the military, he became a permanent traveler. He considers himself a student of the world and believes that travel is the greatest teacher. Also, that in order to achieve true freedom, you have to make money independently, control your time, and eliminate the mindset that you are subject to a corrupt government bent on degrading your personal liberty. Welcome, Simon Black, to the Borderless Podcast.
Thanks very much.
So, Simon, like I said, I've been really enjoying your articles for years, and in the past year, I've listened to every one of your podcasts. I guess it would be good for us to ask you, tell us a little bit about your childhood, if you don't mind. Where are you from, and how did you get started in this life?
Oh, the childhood is, what is it they say? The thing we spend the rest of our lives getting over.
Okay.
No, I had a great childhood. Pretty normal, really. I grew up in outside of Dallas, Texas, and nothing particularly remarkable about that. It wasn't like I grew up in the jungles of Nicaragua or anything like that. And when I was 17, I went off and decided that I wanted to go to the military academy at West Point, and spent 4 years there, graduated, and spent several years as an Army intelligence officer. And it was really at that point, that was the most formative time in my life. That was the time for me where I felt like not everything was as it seemed. I grew up sort of believing the same things that most other people believe. And I started really thinking for myself. I started thinking independently while I was in the Army, which was kind of a dangerous thing to do. Not a great career move, but it changed my life for the better in the most profound way possible. And here I am today. So that's the quick version.
And so, at what point did you take your leave from the Army?
I got out in I had the opportunity to spend time in from, I guess, 2000 till very late 2000. Oh, my years all run together. I think I've been out for over 10 years now. And the first place that I went when I got out of the Army was Panama. I started traveling. When I got back to the United States, it didn't really feel like home anymore. I had changed a lot during my time in. I really started questioning so many things. And I don't know if it's really part of your normal thing to really kind of get into the politics of all of this. So I'll sort of skip that element.
Yes, sir, it is.
Oh, it is. Well, in that case, then perhaps we have a lot to talk about, my friend.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, for me, I thought, I knew without a doubt that the whole premise of the war was complete bullshit. And I had a lot of problems with that. And when I got out, I remember, honestly, there's so many people who would come up. It was sort of like the knee-jerk reaction with people coming up saying things like, thank you for your service. And I know that's what people are sort of told they're supposed to do. Um, and I remember it actually used to make me feel angry because I would think, do you have any idea what you're saying? People with bumper stickers that say support the troops and that sort of thing. And I said, if you want to be, quote, supportive, maybe you should think for yourself too. And really start wondering, what are we really doing over there? What do we just invade a foreign country for based on, a premise of deceit on the idea that there's weapons of mass destruction that don't actually exist, and all these sorts of things. And I remember thinking to myself very clearly, I knew it was a lie in the position that I was in. I knew that we were never going to find any WMDs because they didn't exist. And I remember thinking to myself, wait a minute, if they're lying about this, then what else are they lying about? And that led me down, this rather bizarre rabbit hole where I started to learn about things like the nature of the dollar and debt in the United States and the insolvency of state-controlled pension funds and trust funds and all these things, again, that I was just brought up to believe that turned out to be totally phony. I learned about the nature of the tax system. I learned about the nature of the monetary system and all these things. And it really, some days it just felt like my head was going to explode. But the more I learned, the more I was hungry to learn more about it, just to try and understand it all. And I realized that really so much of what we were brought up to believe just simply wasn't true.
Right.
And it was at that point, then again, it just no longer really felt like home. When I got back, I spent a lot of time overseas. And when I got out of the military, it just felt like so many things had changed. And I didn't feel right anymore. It did not feel like home. Perhaps some of your readers and listeners may be able to identify with this feeling of, just doesn't feel like home. Doesn't feel like the place that I grew up. And it feels like that more and more these days as I go back and visit. I've been living overseas for so long. I've been an expat for so long. That the analogy that I make is, I have a niece, and I see her from time to time, but she's my sister's daughter. My sister lives with her every single day. I see her, several months have passed, and so for me, the changes in her, and her size and height and everything, it's so obvious to me. It just feels so acute immediately, and I can just look at her and say, oh my God, you've just changed so much. Because I'm not there every day like my sister is to see just the subtle changes every day in her daughter's growth. And it's the same thing that I feel when I go back to the United States now. I think, my God, this place has changed so much. All those subtle changes day to day, have accumulated over months and months and months and months at a time. And I feel it so acutely all at the same time when I go back to the United States now. And for me, it's great. I enjoy it. I think it's a wonderful country, and it's wonderful people, and there's very nice things to do, and big stores and all that sort of stuff. But I'm so much happier overseas as I travel. It's a crazy thing to say now. At this point in my life, I feel that the United States has changed so much culturally. I feel more at home in Thailand than I do in Texas. I feel much more at home here in Chile than I do in the United States. And the thing is there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Life presents us a lot of great opportunities, and I've taken the opportunity to live my life overseas, and I feel it's so great. I've honestly, I was just actually talking about this last night over dinner with a friend who came down to visit, saying, I don't remember a time being this happy. I feel very lucky, very happy. I feel like I have a very rich life and a very deep meaning. And for people that are thinking about it and having that feeling of saying, well, maybe this doesn't really feel like home anymore, and I'm not sure, but as human beings, we're wired to be afraid of the unknown. It's why all the things that we do as being part of the unknown, we're so afraid of the unknown, it keeps us intransigent. It's part of Newton's laws of motion that an object at rest will stay at rest. And that force of inertia is so powerful to try and overcome that. And I'm here to tell you, if people are thinking about it, but they're afraid of the unknown, they're afraid of being overseas, I don't speak the language, I've never been, I don't, have a lot of experience, all these sorts of things, it's great. It's really great.
Yeah, it
and
is.
It may be, it may end up being one of the single best decisions that you ever make. And there's so many benefits that just cascade across your entire life and lifestyle and those of your family as well. Living overseas can be one of those incredible experiences for a child if you have children, and that intransigence is very strong. That level of inertia can be so strong for people, particularly as they have family. They say, "Oh, I can't pull my kids out of school because all these sorts of things." And I mean, give me a break. It's one of the most. Do you think your kid's brain is being so rapidly expanded in a state-controlled public school system? Where they're taught to subordinate themselves to authority and learn useless facts and trivia. Do you think that's better than living abroad and experience a different culture and learn almost native fluency of a different language? I mean, it's the opportunities for kids are extraordinary,
right?
And there's so many great things about it, and there's no perfect place, and to be honest, sure, there are always some people that just don't have a good experience for a lot of different reasons. But I'm also here to tell you that there's nothing in life that's irrecoverable. Everything, life is long, and there's always opportunities. If it doesn't work, you can always go back.
Right.
Nothing is permanent here, and and so it's one of those things that it's not as scary as people think it is. The unknown is very scary, but it's really not. It's great. It's fantastic. When I think about what our ancestors had to put up with, I've traced my ancestry, my family history back to 1250, and so we're going on 8 centuries now. And my original ancestor, the guy who came over here, he came over to the United States in 1650. He's one of the original guys to come over. I think about what this guy had to put up with, spending a month and a half on a boat, and when you arrive, there's nothing, except wilderness and danger and peril and the threat of starvation, all these things. And what do? We get on a plane, and in a couple of hours we can be on the other side of the planet, and we complain when the internet sucks.
Right.
That's how we rough it in 2016. I mean, we have it so easy. So honestly, it's really not that scary.
Right. Simon, as I hear you talk about that sort of awakening you had, listeners of this podcast know my experience of waking up to the reality 11 years ago that I was in an apocalyptic religious cult. And, I think the things that we're talking about are the same. It's informed my experience on the path you described too. It's just remarkable the way that the human mind can both be deceived and participate in its own deception, isn't it?
That's exactly right. I mean, it's exactly as you say it. I mean, we build our own limitations in our own minds. Our brains are actually the human brain is actually rather pitiful at risk assessment. We view things that are extremely risky as low risk, and things that are low risk as extremely risky. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the things I talk about a lot in my letter is I talk about, and this may or may not be pertinent to your audience, but I'll mention it anyways. I talk a lot about banking systems around the world. And when you think about a bank, nobody ever questions the financial sanctity of their bank. It's just this hallowed ground of, no one can question, the bank. It's this esteemed institution, and of course it must be safe because it's a bank. But when you really look at the numbers, and of course banks publish this data. Banks publish this data every quarter, and they say, here's our balance sheet, here's our financial condition. You look at it and say, oh my God, this bank is extremely illiquid. This bank is borderline insolvent. And the institution that's supposed to insure the bank, the FDIC, fails to meet the minimum capitalization requirements that are set forth by law, by the Dodd-Frank Act. And of course, the FDIC is backed by a federal government, which by its own financial statements published by the Financial Management Service at the Department of Treasury show that the government is insolvent. So you've got an illiquid, poorly capitalized bank backed by an undercapitalized insurance fund supported by an insolvent government. Now, if you were a benevolent space alien who came to planet Earth, and so you lived your whole life devoid of any propaganda, devoid of any public opinion, devoid of any social influence, and said, look at this financial statement and tell me if you think this is a safe place to put my money, they'd say, you're nuts if you put your money here. but we're manipulated. Our brains are so easily manipulated because, well, everybody else is doing it, so it must be safe. No, nobody else has just bothered to look at the data. Mm-hmm. And by the way, this is publicly available data. This isn't Simon Black's analysis. This is the banks telling you. This is the government telling you, oh, by the way, we're insolvent if anyone cares. So this is a thing where our brains just become blind to these obvious risks and say, oh, there's no risk there. Of course there's risk there, but our brains are really terrible at that. Right. And so it works the same way in the opposite. And I agree with you entirely that we create our own, in many cases, our own mental prisons to keep us, to keep that inertia very strong.
Yes. You posted an article a couple of months ago just about something you noticed. Now, I think you may dabble in Bitcoin. I do a little bit too. I think the people who object the most to Bitcoin are people who think someone is coming to them and telling them, put all your money in Bitcoin, which no one is doing as far as I know. But you were basically explaining to people how if your concern about Bitcoin is that it is a digital currency, guess what? What's the reality about the rest of the currencies?
All right, they're all digital. The dollar is a digital currency. The euro is a digital currency. The Mexican peso is a digital currency. If you look at the numbers in the United States, again, this isn't my opinion. This is data that's published by the Treasury Department and by the Federal Reserve of the United States. There's really less than roughly around 10% of all the entire U.S. money supply is actually in physical cash. Everything is really digital. When you think about, if you send money, to one of your employees or something like that, if you write a check or you send them a wire transfer or something like that, there's no, your bank doesn't give a satchel full of cash to some Pony Express rider right. to send him galloping off across the West with a bag full of money to deliver it to your employee or your brother-in-law or whoever you send the money to. No, it happens electronically. Mm-hmm. All they're doing is they're just updating an accounting ledger. They're just updating a ledger that's held in an electronic database somewhere in a bank's computer system. That's all it is. That's all. It's digital. It's completely digital. The only difference is that Bitcoin, instead of being highly centralized, or there's a government authority and a central bank and a central bank database and all these things, instead it happens to be completely decentralized. But for people that don't understand, they think, oh, well, digital currency doesn't exist. Dollars don't exist. Euros don't exist. None of these things exist. It's a very, very small fraction of the. And there's certain societies like Sweden that are actually quite proud of saying we want to go completely cashless, and that percentage of physical currency versus the sort of digital form of the currency is becoming smaller and smaller. So that's not really a reason to be to be sort of anti-Bitcoin. I'm not, by the way, the Bitcoin. I don't think it's the panacea that's going to, bring world peace and then the unicorns to come out and all those things. I really mostly really appreciate the blockchain technology.
Right.
I think that's revolutionary. I think it's game changing. I think that's really going to fundamentally change the financial system for the better and really bring about a brand new financial system. But in general, when I talk to people, and there's some pretty famous guys that are kind of household names in finance, and I spend a lot of time with some of these guys. I have dinner with them, and somebody will kind of bring up in a conversation, say, "Does anybody know anything about Bitcoin? It feels like a scam to me." And my response is, if it feels like a scam, if your reaction is it's a scam, and you haven't, and you're saying that not really knowing anything about it, that's really an indication that maybe you should educate yourself about it first. Educate yourself and understand it. And once you understand it, then you're in a position to make a decision about whether or not you think it's appropriate for you. But I think the knee-jerk reaction to say it's different, therefore it's bad, again, that goes back to these flaws that we have in our human brains. Our human brains, we fear the unknown, and we automatically think that things are different are bad. That sense of our mentality has given rise to some of the most absurd things, including racism and racial prejudice and all those sorts of things in our lives that we can point to go, that's really dumb. It's the same thing as that similar reaction where our brains say, oh, it's different than what I'm used to, so I don't like it. And no, that's just an opportunity to get to know it a little bit better.
Right. And in line with this subject, one of the topics that you bring up all the time that is of interest to me has to do with the nature of the U.S. dollar being the the world reserve currency. And I know most of our audience gets this, but if we could just for a moment explain, what is it that the United States government gets for their currency being the world reserve currency? What advantage do they have in that?
Well, it's so much advantage. There's a lot of advantages. The primary advantages are it means that that the Federal Reserve really can print as much money as it wants. And of course, I say print, I'm doing air quotes so you can't see me,
right.
Because just as we said, there's not really very much physical currency anymore. So they're not printing pieces of paper, but they are creating money electronically, essentially, and they get to do as much of that as they want to, and the rest of the world just accepts it, says, well, okay, fine. And again, this isn't my conjecture; these are real numbers. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet since the 2008 financial crisis increased from about $850 billion to $4.5 trillion. So that's essentially a 500% increase in the size and the amount of U.S. dollars that there are in the world. That's an astounding increase when you think about it. There's nothing backing that up. It's just an unelected committee of central bankers. You didn't elect these people. I didn't elect these people. Nobody elected these people. But they have essentially, they wield totalitarian control of the money supply and can wake up tomorrow and say, I feel like creating $1 trillion. And they just conjure this money out of thin air. Now, if they did that in Zimbabwe, which they did, they got hyperinflation.
Right.
If they do that, they don't get away with that in Chile. They don't get away with that in all these other places in the world. If the government of Costa Rica decided that they wanted to print 1 trillion Costa Rican colones, there would be hyperinflation. But the U.S. government gets to do that all day long simply because their dollars are so widely used around the world.
Right.
Now, what does that mean? Dollars used around the world, meaning that, like, if the price of oil, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or Norway, is priced and quoted and settled in U.S. dollars. And so, if a Brazilian merchant does business with a supplier in Bangladesh, they'll settle that transaction in U.S. dollars. So it's the thing that a lot of people don't realize, that U.S. dollars are used in commercial transactions, institutional transactions, government bank balances. The government of Sri Lanka is holding U.S. dollars. The government of Lebanon is holding U.S. dollars. The governments all around the world, central banks around the world, everybody uses U.S. dollars. And so because of that, the Federal Reserve can create an extraordinary amount of U.S. dollars. It also means that the U.S. government can go into debt, that the U.S. government can go from when Obama was elected, there was just over $10 trillion in U.S. government debt. Now there's almost $19 trillion in U.S. government debt. And so the federal government of the United States can say, oh, here's a bunch of debt. We want to borrow everybody's money. And so because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, because all these things all around the world are priced and quoted and settled in U.S. dollars, and governments hold U.S. dollars and central banks hold U.S. dollars, it gives the United States the ability to print a lot of money. It gives the government of the United States the ability to go into debt, and lots of debt. And frankly, it's a bizarre privilege that has been abused over and over again, to the point that future generations that won't be born for decades will spend their entire working lives paying down this debt.
Right. And so with reference to this, so you've given us an understanding of what the advantages are that come with having the world reserve currency. What happens, in the simplest terms possible, according to Simon Black, if and when the United States loses that status?
Well, let's not even ask Simon Black. Let's just look in the history book. I mean, history is very clear on this point. Mm-hmm. This is not the first time there has been a world reserve currency. The idea of a reserve currency goes back over 1,000 years. The Byzantine solidus, which goes all the way back to, this is essentially the Eastern Roman Empire, which goes back to the 9th century A.D. The Byzantine gold solidus was the world's reserve currency for quite some time. You found Byzantine gold solidus coins all over the world. You found it in Asia, North Africa, etc. And it was displaced. It was displaced by the Venetian gold ducat. And the reason it was displaced was because for years, decades, the government of the Byzantine Empire was debasing the gold content in their coin. And so you were expecting a certain amount of gold in the coin, and then the government would shave off quite a bit of gold and debase the content. And it happened, and people got really tired of it around the world. And there were threats, we're going to get off of this standard. And the Byzantine government said, okay, no, we'll go back to that. And so they rebased the coin. And then again, they started doing it again. One day they started debasing the coin, and all these other countries of the world said, fool me twice, shame on me. And at that time, wealth and power had shifted. Byzantine Empire was traditionally the dominant superpower, but by the early part of the last millennium, really, it were the Italians that had kind of displaced the Byzantine Empire. That all the wealth and power had shifted. Now suddenly, all these wealthy city-states in Italy became the dominant trading power. The Byzantine Empire no longer had the same economic power. So the Italian city-states stepped up, and Venice and Florence said, we'll start creating these new coin. And so it was Venetian gold ducats and Florentine florins that became the dominant reserve currency. And what happened to the Byzantine Empire? Basically went away. This has happened over and over and over again. It used to be the British pound. We've seen French livres and Spanish real de ocho, pieces of 8. And so forth. All the Spanish pieces of 8 were actually legal tender in the United States of America well into the 19th century, basically up until the Civil War period. And so, there have always been other reserve currencies in the world. And basically, whenever you lose that reserve status, it coincides with the decline and general economic and social decline of your country. And when you overall lose that status, it eliminates your ability to go out into financial markets and just conjure money out of thin air and continue to base the currency. And you start having to live within your means. And in many respects, you see these countries going bankrupt and having to default on their debts. The only thing that keeps the U.S. afloat, the U.S. government has to borrow money just to pay interest on the money that it's already borrowed. That's not a sustainable financial position to be in. And the only reason they're able to do that is because they're able to borrow so much money. The reason they're able to borrow so much money is because everyone else in the world accepts the dollar as the global international reserve standard. If that were to change, then they wouldn't be able to print so much money. They wouldn't be able to borrow so much money. They wouldn't be able to borrow money just to pay interest on the money that they've already borrowed. And they start having to live within their means. They have no idea how to live within their means. The only thing they know how to do is spend more money. And the consequences of that are rather extreme. They have to get that money from somewhere. They have to default, which creates really a worldwide financial crisis, or they have to start confiscating funds from their own citizens in the form of higher taxes or just outright confiscation. And of course, last year, you probably saw this interesting little tidbit was that it found that the government of the United States, through civil asset forfeiture, has actually confiscated more wealth from citizens than thieves and petty criminals.
Yes,
that was a first
right.
In 2015. That's hope and change right there.
Yeah.
So
I believe that was an article by George Will, wasn't it?
George Will he cited that, yeah. I think there were some other folks that came across that data. And that by the way, that was just using the FBI's own data. Right. I mean, the FBI actually keeps this data. The government keeps this data on the totals of civil asset forfeiture as well as the total dollar amount of property crime and theft in the United States. It's just a question of comparing two numbers that are maintained by the FBI itself. And
in accord with this, we were just talking about deception and self-deception. The reality, the enormity of the U.S. government's position financially and the debt that it's in, so many people, individual citizens, certainly politicians, and even economists just seem so comfortable with that, don't they?
Well, the State of the Union address was last night. You didn't hear the President of the United States mention the nearly $19 trillion in U.S. federal debt once. The word debt just doesn't come up. It doesn't come up. They're so, I don't know that they're oblivious, but there's zero sense of urgency at all. But frankly, even if there was a sense of urgency, it wouldn't matter because they're far past the point of no return of being able to pay down the debt. Some people think rather erroneously that they can just raise taxes, and if they raise taxes, that they'll be able to take in all this extra money and pay down the debt. I often remind people that in the modern history of the United States, which I would define as since the end of World War II, tax rates in the United States have been all over the board. They've had excise taxes and estate taxes, corporate taxes, individual income tax rates that have been as high as 90%. And so by comparison, today's income tax rates are actually quite low on a historical basis. And yet in all that time, the total amount of tax revenue collected by the United States government as a percentage of GDP is equal to roughly 17.7%. So every year in and year out, regardless of how high tax rates go or how low tax rates go, it doesn't really matter. The U.S. government collects roughly 17.7% of GDP year in and year out, almost without exception, for the past 6-7 decades. Just very small variations of that. So that the whole point is that the government slice of the pie stays almost the same.
Right.
It doesn't matter. And so as the debt gets bigger and bigger and bigger as a percentage of GDP, and the government's tax revenue as a percentage of GDP stays the same, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. You don't have to be a Nobel Prize winning economist to see, wait a minute, the debt as a percentage of GDP gets bigger every year, but the tax revenue with which they have to pay down the debt stays exactly the same. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where that goes. That's just simply not sustainable. And whether it happens, whether something bad happens this year or next year or 2 weeks from now or 2 decades from now is kind of irrelevant.
Right.
The whole thing that I always tell my readers is say, look, you can see that this doesn't have a happy ending. So, it's a question of taking sensible steps in your own personal situation to protect yourself from the potential consequences of this. And if you want to know what they are, we kind of talk about them all the time. I always look to history for this, to say this is not the first time this has happened. There's always been a dominant superpower. They've always changed. There's always been debt problems. There's always been reserve currency issues, all these things. And so all I have to do is just look and see what's happened in the past and just extrapolate a little bit. And we can see where the challenges and problems may be.
Right. And obviously looking to history only makes sense. Simon, you published an article recently I want to talk to you about, but we need to take just a moment for our sponsor. Today's Borderless podcast, sponsored by the Condescending Group. You've heard of microaggressions, everyday verbal and nonverbal snubs or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to persons of a quote-unquote marginalized group. Well, yesterday in her article, condescending columnist Dahlia Evergreen proposed a new term, nanoaggressions. She says nanoaggressions refer to even tinier insults that involve virtually unnoticeable facial tics or eye movements. She writes, even people whose minds are not bigoted may actually have nervous systems that are racist or sexist. Does your eyelid occasionally twitch? Well, if so, it means your nerves look down on the transgendered. Do you ever get hiccups? That's an obvious indication that somewhere within your spinal cord lies deep-seated doubts about Native Americans. She goes on to suggest that even breathing in the presence of minorities is a preposterous autonomic insult, and that wouldn't the world just be better off if white heterosexual males stopped breathing altogether anyway? Think about it. Ms. Evergreen has published a 1,600-page book that details virtually every formerly considered normal bodily action and how it proves you are surely an asshole. Go to thecondescendinggroup.com now and click on the white guy with his hands clasped in apology. The Condescending Group, we care more than you. Okay, we're back to the Borderless podcast, and we're talking to Simon Black of Sovereign Man. You put out an article today, I think it was actually written by Tim Price, though, about a parallel between this situation, kind of Jurassic Park, because we know things are not, all you have to do is look at the math. And as Simon is always saying on his podcast and in his articles, these are not Simon Black's crazy assertions. The General Accounting Office, the various divisions of government are saying this. So this is a reality, but somehow we just have this sense that smart, caring people are taking care of us, sort of in the way in the original Jurassic Park movie. People just believed that these dinosaurs could not mate, propagate, and multiply. Oh no, we've arranged that. Our scientists have arranged for them. They're all female. And of course, the Jeff Goldblum character recognized that no matter what it is that you think, you cannot control nature. And it's the same thing with complex systems such as governments, billions of people, banking systems. We don't know when it's going to happen or where it's going to happen. And frankly, I don't listen too closely to people who claim to know a date or a time. We just know that this is not sustainable, don't we?
That's right. The analogy, Tim Price is a big movie buff. He's a wealth manager in London and is kind enough to put out a weekly piece for us. And he writes one of the products that we have that's basically about financial education. And he's a big movie buff. And so he's talking about this in Jurassic Park. And yeah, it's just, you go to this theme park and we think, oh, okay, there's clearly some risk there, these giant, dinosaurs, and to assume that there's no risk is foolish. And yet, people say, oh, well, the scientists have figured this out, so we must be safe. And you're right. It's exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. The quote from the Jeff Goldblum character, the chaotician, in the movie is, well, it doesn't matter, paraphrasing, it doesn't matter what you've done. You might have thought you've covered all the angles, but what he says is life always finds a way. Nature always finds a way. And whether you're talking about nature in our physical universe or nature in the financial universe, always finds a way. And most people, I would argue that most people on the planet don't have a clue how central banking works, but the general consensus, the theme out there is that, oh, well, rest easy because, there's these smart guys and they're taking care of it. So, okay, well, I won't even think about that. I'm sorry, but that's a really foolish thing to do. Right. It's important to understand that. When you think about money is one of the greatest social technologies that exists. Language is a social technology. It's something that, nobody really owns it. We all use it. It's so important in our day-to-day lives. Money is crucial. It is the lifeblood of any economic activity. It's so important in our daily lives. It is a social technology, and yet it is a social technology that we have awarded nearly totalitarian control to an unelected committee of people who, by the way, have a serial track record of complete and total failure. They never get it right. Guys like Ben Bernanke, who chaired the Federal Reserve, who said, oh, no, there won't be any problems, that we've never had a nationwide, housing prices nationwide have never gone into decline. And then it happened. And they said, oh, no, don't worry, nationwide housing price declines won't cause problems in the broader economy. And then it happened. And all these things over and over again, every time they have some grand prognostication, it's always wrong. And yet these are the people who, by the way, are not elected by this supposedly democratic republic in which people live, have total control over the money supply. They always get it wrong, and they sit in a little room somewhere, and they make decisions that affect the lives of nearly every single person, not in the country, but on the planet. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say the planet is because the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency. So what happens to the U.S. dollar affects nearly every single person on the planet. It doesn't matter if you're in Boston or Bhutan. What happens to the dollar affects everybody. Right. And there's this unelected committee that sits there who is notoriously wrong about almost everything. Yeah. And they have total control over this. And people just say, oh, well, it's going to be fine. And I think that's a really foolish thing to do because the data shows that they're always wrong. And we think there are so many billions of pieces in an economy. We think that these men and women can just sit there and pull all the levers and turn all the dials, and they're just going to get it right consistently day to day. I mean, can you imagine being in some nuclear control room and being solely responsible to have to, move all the dials and pull all the levers and just make the big machine work all day, every day? It's just not possible. It's so foolish to think that that's just going to be okay.
Right. Most of our audience is, I'm sure, very much in line with what we're talking about. The last 30-some minutes have been a guilty pleasure for me because this is what I'm concerned about. The reality is, when James Guzman and I started this podcast, it was James's wishes, and certainly mine too, that it not be with a focus on politics. There's enough of that. Our interest was in talking to people who are looking for a better life, possibly an international life, a life of more self-reliance. And the reality is there may be a number of reasons why people are motivated to pursue such a life. Some of you just might find it fun or exciting. But for a lot of us, one of the reasons that we might be looking for what Simon Black would call us a plan B is because of concerns, because of thinking maybe I shouldn't hitch my wagon to a system that seems increasingly out of control. And so we've been talking for the last 30-some minutes here about reasons for concern. Now, I don't know about Simon. I know me. I'm not interested in preaching to the choir, or I'm not interested in converting anybody anymore. That would be nice. But we know a lot of people are already awake to this reality. And so what does a plan B involve then practically, Simon?
Well, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. But I mean, that's one of the things that I'm saying a lot to our readers, our audience, is look, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that when you have this much debt, when you have this kind of system, it's absurd. And we can already see all of it changing. We can see wealth and power shifting. We can see this. We can see that the United States share of global GDP has been in substantial decline, not just for months or years, but really for decades. This is something that's been happening for quite a long time. You can look at, what this share of U.S. GDP, U.S. GDP share of global GDP over the last 5 years, 10 years, 25 years. You can see the trend. That's a major shift in wealth and power. We can see all kinds of social indications. We can see, for example, something that came out just, I think, maybe 2 months ago, talk about how the middle class in the United States is now no longer the dominant group in society. Now, the middle class is now no longer the overwhelming majority of the population in the United States. That's something, again, that's a long-term trend. It doesn't happen day to day or even month to month. It happens over years, sometimes even decades. And these are the results of decades and decades of conjuring money out of thin air and going into debt and a government that creates hundreds of pages of legislation and rules and regulations every single day. Every day. Today, this morning, the government of the United States, which they do this every single day of the year, every business day of the year, they publish 369 pages of new regulations just today. And tomorrow there's going to be even more, and the next day there's going to be even more. I mean, it's utterly. I mean, it's 70, 80,000 pages a year. These are the sorts of things that happen. And so you have a couple of options. You can either say, you can either be one of what most people will do is to stick their heads in the sand and say, oh, it's going to be fine. Those smart people in Washington, they're going to figure it out. And that's what most people are going to do. Then there's going to be a minority of people that recognizes what's going on, but their course of action is to despair. Their course of action is to be upset, despondent, panicked, and in many cases even depressed. They'll spend their days, fretting and worrying about, what might happen and when and all these things, and probably even try and convert their friends and neighbors and get everybody to understand and so forth. And there's a very even smaller group that's going to go with option 3. And option 3 is when you educate yourself in a very rational way about what's really happening. What's the system right now? What's happening to it? Where is it going? And then take very sensible steps to figure out, okay, where am I at risk? How do I reduce this risk? What are the sensible things that I can do to reduce this risk so that no matter what happens, I'm going to be okay? That if things go horribly wrong and this whole system collapses and all these sorts of things, the steps that I've taken mean that I'm going to be okay. But even if nothing happens, right, I'm going to be okay. If it happens today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or even never, I'm going to be okay. And if nothing ever happens ever, I'm not going to be worse off for having done this.
Right. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the point you make in all of your articles. Our aim is to help you no matter what happens. And right, unlike people who like to make apocalyptic predictions, I mean, maybe we'd like to do that, but the reality is, you just cannot predict the future with any certainty. You can know something's wrong and you can get ready for it. And those measures that you recommend taking are measures you're better off with anyway, aren't they?
That's correct. I'm kind of fond of telling people, if you're, I use the banking system as an example. If you can look at your banking system, say, okay, I've got an illiquid bank, borderline insolvent bank, borderline insolvent central bank, undercapitalized insurance fund, and an insolvent government. Gee, should this really be the place that I hold the totality of my savings? Right. Everything that I've ever earned and will achieve in life, I'm going to put in that system? Maybe that doesn't make sense. Maybe I should learn about other systems and other places where I can go and put my money where the government has no debt and the insurance fund is actually capitalized. And it's a system where there's never been a banking failure ever. And the banks are liquid and well capitalized and conservatively managed. And I look at that and I go, it's hard to imagine that I'm going to be worse off holding at least a portion of my savings in a place where the banks are liquid and well capitalized and backed up by a well capitalized insurance fund, backed by a government that is strong and powerful and wealthy and has no debt. Right. In a country that's never had a banking failure. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that that's somehow a bad thing. It's hard for me to imagine that by moving my retirement funds into a vehicle that gives me more influence over the direction of my retirement savings. That somehow having more control and influence over where my retirement funds go, that somehow that's a bad thing. It's hard for me to imagine that I'm worse off for taking more more control and having more influence over my own money. It's hard for me to imagine that having an option, of a place I might want to go or a place I might want to spend time is a bad thing, or having a productive, profitable, cash flow positive investment abroad is somehow a bad thing, or having control and access over my own organic food supply is somehow a bad thing. These things to me make sense no matter what happens. And sure, if something really bad happens, then that might make all the difference in the world.
Right.
But if something, nothing ever happens, then, oh, well, I'm not worse off for it.
Right. So let's imagine someone, perhaps, we have listeners all over the world, but let's say someone in the United States, is in category 2. They are awake in a sense, and maybe they are despairing, and they would like to move in the direction of category 3 that you described. And what is one thing, any of them can open up a bank account in a safer jurisdiction, right? They can do that, and that's easy.
Well, I mean, everybody's got a different situation, but for the most part, yeah. I mean, if you're an American, it's a completely legitimate thing to do. There are certain disclosures and forms that need to be filed, but it's completely normal and legitimate thing that people do. It's actually interesting is that the President of the United States in his State of the Union address last night didn't bother mentioning the nearly $19 trillion in federal debt, or the more than $8 trillion in debt that's been accumulated since he became president. He didn't bother mentioning any of that. He did, however, mention offshore bank accounts, which I thought was a little bit bizarre, talking about hiding money in offshore bank accounts, as if anybody that has a bank account in a safe, stable jurisdiction abroad is somehow a nefarious criminal or a tax cheat or something like that. But the fact of the matter is, this is a completely legitimate and permissible thing to do. And again, I would suggest is perhaps something that might make sense no matter what.
Right. So there are a couple of different demographics, it seems, who are very engaged by the idea of living outside of the U.S. or their country of birth. And there are the digital nomad crowd. A lot of them listen to our podcast. And then there are those who are either they've found a way to become location independent, or they're inching toward retirement or are in retirement. Would you say, can you give us the top 2 or 3 reasons why a U.S. citizen would consider relocating abroad?
I mean, it's different for everybody,
right?
Honestly. I mean, some people have that feeling of, this isn't the country that I grew up in, and I want to get out of here as fast as I can. Some people are looking for more freedom in that respect. Some people are looking for better lifestyle options. They like the idea of moving to a place where the sun shines all the time, and there's a lot of cool stuff they can do, whatever. And it's interesting. It's fun. I think that's probably a lot of the digital nomad crowd. Some people do it, for retirement, because their retirement savings goes a lot longer way, a lot farther in a place like Ecuador or Colombia than it does in Southern California. There's so many reasons. Some people might do it for medical reasons, because they get higher quality treatment. I mean, if I were, had a chronic condition that required long-term care, I would probably be living in Thailand, where I could have for a couple $100 a month, I could have my own full-time live-in staff to take care of me in the finest private hospital, one of the finest private hospitals in the world. You'd be treated for pocket change. I mean, so there's so many different reasons for that. I think as well, there's business opportunities, investment opportunities. And a lot of reasons I think people should move overseas, but they don't, because they don't realize that it's even an opportunity.
Right.
As an example, I would say, particularly for younger people, I think there are a lot of younger people that are attracted to the idea of living overseas. There's a big kind of lifestyle design crowd that's interested in heading abroad and all those sorts of things. But I think for a lot of folks, particularly younger people, younger folks in particular, of course that's all relative, tend to move abroad with the idea of recreation and leisure.
Right.
And I'll be honest with you, I think that's the wrong idea. Mm-hmm. I hold an entrepreneurship camp every year that we do. It's not for profit. I finance it all out of my own pocket. I invite some of the most successful and accomplished entrepreneurs I know. And we fly out to basically a little retreat, and we talk about this kind of stuff for a week to people that have been handpicked out of an extensive selection process. And that's one of the things that we say over and over again. And, when you're in your 20s, you don't have that opportunity ever again. Your 20s come and go very quickly, as anybody who's not in their 20s can probably attest. And it is the only time in your life that you are, you don't have any obligations. You probably don't have a mortgage. You might not have a family to feed or any of those sorts of things. You have the ability to go halfway across the world and find somebody to be mentored by.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry. Please finish.
No, I was just going to say, it actually pains me, I think, to see so much of a generation that is kind of focused more on leisure, to say, I want to move to the beach in Costa Rica because that's where the great surf is. And that might be a lot of fun and a fun way to spend your youth. But I can promise you, your life will be much more rewarded, and you'll live a more meaningful and, I think, richer life if you choose to invest that very precious time that you have in a way to become much more productive, to really be able to create a lot of value in the world. And I think that's the time to really learn that. And I think you can learn that overseas in many respects. So that's my soapbox.
Right. And I think one way of looking at that is, Simon, you're fairly young, right? What, late 30s or something?
Thank you for saying that. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, late 30s. Well, I'm about 10 years old.
I'm 37.
37. Wow, I'm 12 years older than you. So the thing is, what I've come to discover is, good luck trying to change people's motivations. If that's their motivation, good. But what we get a lot of at the Borderless podcast and Borderless blog are people deeply interested in a more international life for some of the reasons you describe, but they're also very motivated to have this just freer life. And, they should know that in addition to having a freer life, maybe having more fun in their life, there are really good, important, practical reasons why they might consider internationalizing, why they might consider relocating. And, there's one thing that I discovered some years ago when I was considering this option, and I started my search down in Chile for a place on the globe that would be right for me, ended up here in Mexico, but was an awareness that while it's true the United States is one of only 2 countries in the world that tax you based on citizenship. Every other country may tax the hell out of you, but if you leave, they recognize, well, what right do we really have to tax you? The United States owns your ass, friends. And the only other government apparently who does this is Eritrea, but they really don't enforce it, and it's 2% anyway. But there is one caveat to that. There's a provision called the foreign earned income exclusion. Can you help people to understand that, Simon?
The foreign earned income exclusion is basically it means that you can go abroad if you're living abroad, and there's 2 ways that the IRS defines sort of living abroad, how you can qualify for this. But if you're living abroad, then you are allowed to earn roughly around $100,000 up to $100,000 a year. I think it's a little bit over $100,000 for tax year 2016. And you can earn that amount of income and essentially not be taxed on that, not pay federal income tax on that.
Right.
Now, there's a few caveats to that. One is it's important to distinguish earned income from, say, investment income.
Exactly.
So if you're trading stocks and currencies and options and commodities and that sort of thing, that's considered investment income. It's not earned income. If you are, if you have a job, if you're working independently, as a freelancer or something like that, that would be, you're actually laboring in exchange for money. That would be considered earned income and potentially qualify for the foreign earned income exclusion. The other thing is that in addition to the foreign earned income exclusion, there's also housing allowances, housing exclusion, or housing deduction, depending on which one you qualify for, which can take your sort of overall package up to $150,000 or more,
right,
that you can sort of earn and pay a very, very low rate of tax. There's a small tax you pay on the housing allowance, and then basically nothing on that $100,000 in earned income. And the 2 ways to qualify for that are what the IRS calls the physical presence test, which means you have to essentially spend more or less 11 months out of the year overseas. which for some people is kind of hard. You know, they have family, have commitments and things in the United States, so they need to go back and forth to the United States with a little bit more regularity. The other is called the bona fide residency test, and that's where you can demonstrate to the IRS that you really are living overseas. You don't just say it on paper. You really are. You know, you have a home. You've got you have a real life overseas. You have a bona fide, real, true, and good faith life abroad. You've got friends. You got family. It's not like, oh yeah, I went to Mexico and paid some guy to get residency, and I'm living the rest of my life in the U.S. and my kids are in Topeka, Kansas, and my wife's in Topeka, Kansas, and I still own my house and all my stuff and all that stuff is there in Topeka, Kansas. No, that doesn't count. You actually have to be living in San Miguel de Allende. You actually have to be with a house and your family and your stuff and your gym membership and all that sort of stuff to actually show, no, I really do have a life here. And that's kind of more a qualitative approach to this foreign earned income exclusion than it's just a particular number of days that you spend out of the country.
Right. And so for people listening to this, we're talking about, living, if you're officially living outside of the United States, not having to pay any federal income tax on about the first $100,000 or so, and possibly more of your earned income. You need to Google that. I'll put that in the show notes as to what exactly earned income is. And so what could you do with that? Can you just picture in your mind how much money that would be and what you could do with it? It could be that you yourself or friends you're concerned about condemning you would say, certainly politicians of every stripe would say there's something immoral about getting out of those taxes. But Simon, you had an experience not long ago that might help somebody appreciate what really might be done with that money instead of having it go to purposes that you have no interest in and are terribly wasteful. What did you do with that money?
Look, I'm of the opinion that if you look at how governments spend tax money, and when we say tax money, let's be very specific about what that is. That's your money, and it's my money, and it's everybody else's money who pays that tax. And what do they do with that money? They wage war. They drop bombs by remote control on people that they've never met. They destroy children's hospitals in faraway lands. And then when they screw up, they say, I'm sorry. And then they go and they do it again.
Right.
They put a lot of money in their pocket through graft and corruption. They build the most absurd bridges to nowhere and crumbling infrastructure projects and all these things. That's what they do. That's what they do. And to me, if you truly disagree with what governments and politicians do with your money, and if you're fed up and sick to death and all this, with the process and what they do, the least valuable thing you can do is go to a voting booth and vote. Mm-hmm. We're told our entire lives to say, if you have a problem with government, go down and let your voice be heard at the voting booth. And that is a completely pointless, trivial, and even demeaning thing to do. Because most of the time you're left with this wide open choice of two candidates, neither of whom is one that you particularly care for. And to go and just to presume that that's just going to go and fix the problem is foolish. It never does. We never get the hope and change that we were looking for. We always get something that we get more debt, more bombs, more drones, more wars, more body scanners. That's what we get. And if you really want to make a change, and you really want to be part of that, then we have to be honest with ourselves and say what really matters in the world. Well, you know what? The world's all about its money. It's money that really counts, and governments get their money from you. Mm-hmm. They get it from me, and they get it from all the people listening. That's where they get the money. And if you really want to make change, then you take all the legal steps that you have available to reduce the amount of money that you put in their pockets. And only then can you really feel like you're actually doing something. Now, because of the foreign earned income exclusion and these things, that we've been talking about, my tax bill for last year was $0.00. So I can say credibly that I contributed nothing to bombs and drones and killing children overseas and all those sorts of things that I have a huge problem with. And some of this I experienced firsthand. I was in the military.
I didn't particularly care for war then. I don't care for war now. And I'm proud of the fact that I didn't, not a penny of my hard work went to go and finance this. And I'm very proud of that. And I feel that if you really believe, that peace is great, and then you've got a problem with, all these things that they do, I believe that people have a moral obligation to take all the legal steps they have available to keep what they earn. I don't advocate anybody doing anything illegal, but there are so many options, like the foreign earned income exclusion. Gee, what do I have to do? I have to go and suffer, in this nice place that I really enjoy living, where the sun shines, 320 days out of the year, my poor, pathetic, miserable life. And I don't pay any taxes as a result of that. And these guys don't get a penny of my money. And so I don't contribute to that war machine. And I feel really great about that.
Right. And I've been you had an opportunity to help a young man formerly in the military, right? Because of this.
Yeah, there was I came across a guy on the internet who had been in the military as well, and stepped on gotten his leg blown off while he was in Afghanistan. And this, one of, unfortunately, so many people that have come home from the battlefield without a limb. And he had a particularly unique challenge because they had to amputate his leg, and he had a particularly unique challenge because the amputation was so high up on his thigh, he had very little